The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, can Canada punch above its weight in a changing global order? Up first, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, stops by to discuss our nation's role in an increasingly unpredictable world. That's all next on The Agenda. These are very strange times to be a Canadian. Our relationship with the United States hasn't been this bad since the War of 1812. They have a president who, while sitting beside our Prime Minister in the Oval Office, declared that he'd still like us to be his country's 51st state. And we are trying to set a democratic example to a world constantly flirting with increasing illiberal democracy. That's all just another day at the office for our next guest. Bob Rae is Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations and, of course, was Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 95, and it's great to have you back in that chair.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you. It really is.
Your job, I gather, is to go to work every day and to try to push that boulder for peace up the mountain just a little more, a little more, a little more. So let's start with a simple question. How's that going these days?
It's tough. It's very tough right now. We're in a tough space in the world. The thing I think it's important for us as Canadians to remember is that however tough we think it is for us, it's a lot tougher for a great many other people around the world.
Can you compare and contrast? Because 40 years ago during the height of the Cold War, we had, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons at each other's heads, and yet for some reason, it felt safer then than it does today. Is that weird of me to think that?
No, I don't think it's, first of all, Steve, there's nothing weird about you. Whatever some people may say, I've never,
appreciate
it's not
that
an
vote of
adjective
confidence
I've ever used to describe you. There are others, but not one. I would say that there was an awesome stability in the nuclear era. And by the way, we're still living in the nuclear era. And the more countries that have the potential for becoming active in the nuclear field, the more unstable it will become. But because of the sense that the countries involved all had an understanding of what the rules would be and how things would work, and there were lots of conversations behind the scenes, and there were lots of discussions. We had a couple of major confrontations, such as in Cuba in 1962. But I think that the challenge now is that there are no guardrails. We're not living in a world where any rules are being followed. Humanitarian law is not being followed. International law is being abused every day in conflicts all around the world and in the conduct of a great many countries. And it is it's a much less stable time for most people outside a frame of countries that are relatively doing well economically compared to the rest. But for a great many people, the world is really tough. And I think we need to understand that as Canadians. The risk that I see is that we become, as a country, and we become as a world, too preoccupied with, number one, too preoccupied with ourselves, and still not sufficiently thinking about what's happening out there. And the thing of my job, the most important part of my job, I think, is to twofold. One is to tell the world about what we think and what Canadians are about. But secondly is to tell Canadians and to tell our government what the rest of the world is about.
Sure. Well, let's do Exhibit A on perhaps the most unstable part of the world today, or one of them anyway, Russia-Ukraine. And if I may say, you gave a very powerful speech about that 3 years ago. Russia-Ukraine. Let's do a clip. Sheldon, if you would.
We signed up to the Charter because we agreed that we would subject our disputes to processes created by us. Over many, many arduous years and debates, what would be done in the event of a profound difference of opinion between states. We don't go to war. We go to the negotiating table. We go to court. We go to mediators. That's how we resolve disputes. The other way lies madness.
As I say, a very powerful speech, and you got a lot of good notices for yourself and for Canada for making that speech at the United Nations. And yet we're 3+ years later, and they're still dropping bombs on Ukraine. And I wonder how often you go to work and think to yourself, I'm trying to make a difference, but this damn thing just keeps getting worse and worse.
Well, I mean, first of all, I know you might find this hard to believe, but I actually don't go to work thinking about myself. I really don't. I really think that the world is in a tough spot. Ukrainians are in a tough spot. Very difficult circumstances. Russians are continuing to drop bombs on them. The ability of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government to respond to the crisis has been remarkable. They've created a capacity for self-defense that goes well beyond the assistance that any country, including the United States, is providing them. They have an army of over 600,000 people who are out there fighting every day. And it is a very, very tough situation for them. I think we've seen efforts in the last few weeks about trying to find solutions. I think we have to understand one thing, and it's a hard thing for me to have to say, but it's perfectly apparent to me. Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine. And that was true at the beginning of the war. It's true today. Mr. Putin is not interested in peace. He's not interested in a negotiated peace. He's only interested in an intimidated surrender. And the Ukrainians have no intention of doing that. And I hope and pray that enough countries will be continuing to support Ukraine in its struggle, because behind Russia, there's another big country, China, that's ready to supply Russia. And we have North Korea, and we have Belarus and other countries that are supporting the Russians overtly with weapons and other things. We have no choice right now but to keep up the pressure to convince Mr. Putin that he's not going to get Ukraine, and he's not going to get the kind of what I would call intimidated surrender that he wants to get.
That takes will. That takes Western will.
It does.
Do we have it?
I think Canada does. I think Prime Minister Carney has said that very clearly. I know he does. I believe there are countries in Europe that do, that understand the nature of this conflict and understand the nature of the beast that we're dealing with and how challenging it is. People thought, Russia was going to win this war in 3 days or 3 weeks. Didn't happen. They have over 1 million casualties, the Russians. Extraordinary number, incredible. And the Russian economy is not doing well at all.
And yet it persists.
Yet it persists because of the political direction from Putin. And I think increasingly we have to ask ourselves the question, to what extent is China continuing to provide support for Russia that means they say, okay, we're just going to stick it out. It's a very tough proposition, but I still think that surrender is the least good option at this point. And when you have somebody like Mr. Putin who's really not prepared to negotiate in ways that are recognizable as a negotiation, it makes it very hard. And I think actually that the President of the United States has had to come to terms with that. His thought that you could do all this in 24 hours or 48 hours, no, it's much more difficult than that.
You ever met him?
I've met him a couple of times, but very, very briefly, just to shake his hand in a couple of social events. Not recently, not before he became a president.
He seems to be emblematic, and I'm going to try to play this straight up the middle here. I don't want to be a smart aleck about this, but he seems to be emblematic of a kind of leader in a kind of country that is becoming increasingly illiberal, and we see more of them around the world. What is the attraction of that right now?
Well, for me, none.
Right.
Like
but
nothing about it is attractive as an option for our country or for any other country. But I think what it speaks to is people feeling anxiety, people feeling fear, people feeling uncertainty, and the economies of the world not working as well as people would like in terms of seeing the benefits of what's going on coming to them. And then turning to, usually it's a strong man, who will provide them with security and who will provide them with direction and who will, do whatever it is that strong men do. But the the fact that so much of it is oppressive, runs contrary to the rule of law, is whimsical. This is true in all cases of what we see in the behavior of these, is that in fact creates more insecurity. And the notion that you can buy the security of your own country at the expense of everybody else's insecurity is awful. And I think it's not sustainable.
But I'm sure you were one of those leaders who, when the Cold War ended and Bill Clinton was president then, and in the 1990s, and the world looked like it was...
I was premier then. I remember those days. I remember those days very well.
Indeed you should. And yet the world looked like it was embracing more and more the democratic option. And then something happened, and now it's going the other way, and I'm worried that, you and I are of a certain age where it may not flip back the other way before we're out of here.
Well, I think it will. I do think that the case for democracy is an excellent case. If democracy was my client, which in a sense it is in the United Nations, I think the case that we have to make for democracy is extremely powerful. It is, as Winston Churchill said, the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yes.
And it's all the others that we have to worry about. Democracy is not perfect. Sometimes decisions take a long time. Sometimes it's tough and it's hard. But democracy is, to me, it's about freedom. It's about the rule of law. It's about creating greater and greater opportunities for equality and for the good things in life for more and more people. And I think the case can be made and has to continue to be made as to why the democratic idea is such a powerful idea. Thomas Jefferson used to refer to it as an infectious idea. And at that time, during the time of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, it seemed to be. It seemed to be. And we do go through these periods when we make great strides in extending democracy. And now we're in one of those periods when autocracy and cronyism and kleptocracy and corruption and criminal activity in the centers of power is becoming an increasing feature of modern day political life. And it's very tough. I would be a foolish person who would say, don't you find it tough? I find it very tough. And I find it very tough, particularly when we think about the consequences for the people who are the most vulnerable in all of our societies. And that's something that I think we all have to worry about.
Speaking of vulnerable, how vulnerable is the United Nations right now, given the lack of support from this current administration in the United States?
I don't think its existence is vulnerable, but I do think that its well-being is vulnerable. The UN will have to make serious reforms and changes to how it does business, because the business model that they had was dependent on people paying their bills on time and certain countries paying a significant amount to help to build the infrastructure that we built around the world. And it's quite extensive when you look at it's a $75 billion operation, still short of money all the time, but that's the full footprint of the United Nations organizations with an S, not the Secretariat, not the building we see on the East River, but the whole system throughout the world. That budget has been cut by as much as, we don't know exactly what it's been cut by, but we think it's somewhere between 30 and 35%. That's a lot of money to be taking out of the system. So
do we pay our bills on time?
We pay them faster than just about anybody else. We're in what we call the January Club. We pay our bills in January.
Good.
And that's good.
As we
and
should.
I'm proud to say we're paying on time.
We got, okay, because I've known you a long time, you knew this was coming. I want to take advantage of what might be your last visit on this program to do just a little reminiscence.
Not because I'm leaving.
No.
I want to be clear about that.
That is true. That is true.
Because you've decided to leave.
Well, there's a time to come and a time to go. As you've never figured out, because you keep coming back and coming back.
I keep coming back, yeah.
Well, about a decade and a half ago, you were the interim leader of the Federal Liberal Party, which really looked like it was in desperate shape and on its last legs. And I will say this, you don't have to. I think you saved the party. I think the party would have been, it could have gone out of business had you not kept it alive long enough for Justin Trudeau to come along, take it over, win an election, etc. We talked on this program 13 years ago about your potentially seeking the permanent leadership of the Liberal Party at the time, which you declined to do. Could have done it, but declined to do it. A lot of people were urging you to do it. Here's what you said. Sheldon, if you would.
I've heard from a lot of people saying they're disappointed, and you always hear from people who said, I was I was going to support you, and I sort of said, well, like, where the hell were you? So, I mean, there's a lot of people who are there after the fact, but they're not necessarily there before. So life will go on.
Life has gone on, but how often I'm interested, how often do you revisit the decision not to seek the permanent leadership of the Liberals and give yourself a shot at being the only person in history to be both Premier of Ontario and Prime Minister of Canada?
I know you're going to be shocked, and you may not even believe me when I say this. I actually don't think about it a lot.
But that suggests you do a little.
Well, of course, a little. Come on, yes, of course, but don't play gotcha here. I think I made the right decision for the time. Mm-hmm. I believe that if I had run for the leadership in 2013, that I would have lost to Justin Trudeau. I think that's a reality. I could feel that wind, that wind and that wave, and I didn't. That wasn't the only reason I decided not to do it. Part of it was that, in the end, I felt that there were other things I wanted to do, and that I felt that it was unlikely that I would win, and I was not interested in running to sort of turn it into some kind of a race between, the old guy and the new guy and the old guy. I didn't want to play that scenario, although there were some people who were keen to get me in the race. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you're going to support me? They said, no. I said, well, then that tells me something. That tells me something. One thing I can say for you for sure is I have no regrets at all about not having become Prime Minister. It was always a long shot from where I was sitting. And I also think that there are so many ways to serve. The unhappiest people that I know in politics, and there are a lot of unhappy people who are either in or out of politics. Oh, I could have done this. I could have been a contender. Yada, yada. Mm-hmm. I don't do that. And the reason I don't do that is because the lesson of my life, how I've lived my life, is that you get a lot of chances and you get a lot of ways you can serve. And if you give it your best when you serve at whatever you're doing, it's worthwhile and it's fun and it's good. And that's how, I'm not making this up. This is not a peroration. It's something that I believe.
I take you at your word.
I believe it intensely.
Of course,
there's not just one job you can do in politics.
And you've done.
And if you don't get it, you've failed. I don't feel that at all.
Okay, while we're on the subject of strange questions, when you announced you would not seek the permanent Liberal leadership, you read a few lines from a Shakespearean sonnet, which you also quoted, I believe, when you stood down as leader of the Ontario New Democrats. Let's have a little listen to that. Sheldon, if you would.
The painful warrior, favored for fight, after 1,000 victories once foiled, is from the book of honor raised quite, and all the rest forgot, for which he toiled. Then happy I, that love and am beloved, where I may not remove nor be removed. Merci. Thank you very much.
I've heard a lot of farewell speeches in politics. I don't think I've ever heard anybody quote Shakespeare the way you do. And that one in particular. What is it about that piece you like so much?
Because the sonnet is number 25. The sonnet is about no matter, because politics, you think of the baubles of power, you think of the press, you think of the media, you think of the attraction, the lights go on, you think it's there, you think it's real. But what I learned early on, that what was the realest things in my life have been about my relationship with my wife and my relationship with my family and my children, my brother and sister, and my late brother, my family, and my friends, which I value. I value friendship a lot. I have many good friends in many different parts of my life. And these are the things that matter. These are the things that last. These are the things that make a difference. And if you get caught up in the moment of thinking that, power is the thing and the excitement of being, were you in the room with so-and-so and no, that's not the greatest thing in the world. And that is what that sonnet is directly about. When I read it, I said, wow, that speaks so much to me, because sometimes you get pulled away in politics. You get pulled away to, sorry, I've got another thing. I've got something really important to do. I'm more important. I'm here. I'm there. The fact is, those aren't the things that actually matter in life in the end.
You know, Premier, I always call you Premier because you were. We always appreciate the fact that when we put out the call to you, you answer, you come on our program, you have many times over these years, and it's great to see you again, and keep on keeping on.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to say, you know, you and I have had sparring contests, you've chaired debates. I was on shows when I wasn't comfortable in my own skin and I was just learning the ropes. So you and I have grown up together in this business, and it's wonderful to be able to join you on this at this moment in time, because you're just one of the great broadcasters. And by the way, your listeners should know we've become good friends. So it's great.
You never
Great
have
to
been
be
much
with
of a good judge of character, though, right? There we go. Anyway, Premier, Ambassador Bob Rae, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
As we prepare to host the upcoming G7 summit in Alberta, along with attending next month's NATO summit in The Hague, is there an opportunity for Canada to take a more prominent role in a shifting global order? Joining us now to help unpack what opportunities may arise for our nation, we welcome Richard Fadden. He's former director of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and former National Security Advisor to Stephen Harper. He's joining us on the line from the nation's capital. And with us here in studio, Carrie Buck, former Canadian Ambassador to NATO and Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa, and Adam Chapnick, Professor of Defence Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada and co-author of Canada First, Not Canada Alone, A History of Canadian Foreign Policy. Good to have you two in this studio. Carrie, I think for the first time. You've always been on satellite before. And Richard Fadden, thanks for being there for us in the nation's capital. Let's start with this quote here from Avi Ben-Lolo, who was published in the National Post last month. He's the founding chair and CEO of the Abraham Global Peace Initiative, and here's what he had to say. Over the past decade, Canada's presence on the world stage has diminished considerably. We were once known as peacekeepers, moral leaders, and champions of justice, human rights, and international cooperation. Today, we are more likely to be asked, what happened to Canada? In capitals around the world, the question echoes, where is your country's voice? Let's start there. Richard, agree or disagree with the premise of that statement?
Basically, I agree, and I think there are two big reasons for this. One, Mr. Trudeau's ministry was not particularly interested in foreign affairs, defense, and national security, and that shows after a while, and their particular approach to deal with foreign policy through values as opposed to interest has had an impact. And secondly, I think over the past several decades, the fact that we have not maintained any semblance of hard power through either defense or to some degree through development have come together to mean that we have not anywhere near as much influence as we could have. I think it's possible to shift, but it's going to take a little while. It can't be done from one day to the next. And I think we also have to recognize that the world has changed significantly from the time when we were a middle power. And in fact, I'm not so sure that the concept of middle power is as valid as it used to be.
Okay, lots of things to unpack there, which we will over the course of our half hour together. Carrie Buck, your view on that statement.
Well, I agree-ish. I would roll it back at least 20 years. I remember I was in New York substituting for one of our foreign ministers at a foreign minister's dinner under Prime Minister Harper, and one of our close Nordic foreign minister friends came up to me and said, "Where's Canada? We miss Canada." I think the same thing applied under Prime Minister Trudeau's leadership as well. I agree with Dick Fadden that there was a little less interest in the international level. I don't see any signature initiatives coming out of either Prime Minister Trudeau or Prime Minister Harper's era. We've been missing in action, and that's not necessarily our fault. You know, when the international architecture was created, there's been a fivefold increase in the number of states. So of course your voice is harder to be heard. There are new emerging leaders, new emerging middle states in the global south who want a greater say at the table, want an equal voice, so your voice is going to be harder to hear. And then an unpredictable U.S. And we used to be able to draft off U.S. power and use that internationally for our own ends.
Not
That's
now.
harder to do now.
Yep.
But some of the things are in our control. I agree with Dick entirely. We have radically underinvested in both diplomacy and defense over at least the last 2 decades, and we've got to fix that.
Adam.
I'd go back even further. I mean, when Paul Martin became Prime Minister, the first thing he said was Canada's back, to suggest that we hadn't been there. Stephen Harper came in, he went to Afghanistan and said, we're back. And then Justin Trudeau came in and he said, Canada's back. So there's always been this impression the last 30-odd years that Canada's influence has withered in the world. It's somewhat true. I think Kerry's right, that the world's gotten bigger and we haven't gotten that much bigger, so that's part of it. The other part is certainly underinvestment in every which way, shape, or form, as well as less boldness in terms of how we've pursued international issues, which can be good or bad. It's just the way it's been.
Everything's relative, of course. And Richard Fadden, let me just throw a couple of other names of so-called middle powers out there, and maybe you tell us how we're doing relative to them. India, Brazil, Turkey, they're all middle powers. Do they punch above their weight in ways we don't?
I think they punch above their weight in their own region. And in fact, I think you could even argue that they are major powers in their own region. I continue to think that the idea of a middle power isn't one that we should place as much emphasis on as we used to. And I agree with Kerry that the fact that there are more countries make a difference. But I also think the main reason we have not had as much of an impact is not that. It's because we haven't really wanted to. You gotta wanna, and then you have to articulate the national interest, prioritize them, and sustain them over time. And one of the things that I remember from the time I was working in the various jobs you've mentioned, I'd go to a country, they were all happy to see me, but over a beer later on, they would say, the last time we had a Canadian federal minister visit, your head of government has never visited. You don't stay the course. And I think that characterizes our relations with a lot of countries over the course of the last several decades. Not our closest allies, but anybody else with whom we would have to develop relationships and alliances to leverage our influence around the world.
If our prime ministers, and I'm gleaning from the table, literal and figurative here, that this is not simply a case of Mr. Trudeau, but this goes back further than that, if the prime minister of the day reflects the mood or desires of the country, is it possible, Kerry, that we don't want to be a middle power and have a big role in the world? We're very content just sort of minding the store at home as a population.
I don't know if that's true. I think it's less true now. I think Canadians are starting to realize that the world has fundamentally shifted. There are threat vectors hitting Canada that people are starting to feel in their day-to-day lives. COVID, one example. Ukraine grain disruption of supply chains and spikes in food prices. So I think Canadians are starting to realize that the world actually is in Canada. We don't have that luxury of geographic distance that much. Maybe we had it more in the past, but we certainly don't now. So there's a realization, and at the same time, I think that leadership matters. I personally think it's time for a foreign policy review. We haven't had one for decades. Why a review? To engage Canadians in recrafting a narrative about what Canada is in the world.
Do Canadians want to play a bigger role in the world?
I think that Canadians at a surface level always say that they want to play a greater role in the world, but the question is the trade-offs that they're willing to accept. And I think for the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a difference between wanting to play a role in the world and needing to. And we really haven't needed to. And as a result, when the trade-offs came, the choice was, well, we want to at another time when it's less expensive. I agree with Kerry that today, we can't rely on the Americans to keep the system the way we want it to be. As a result, it's not just a matter of want now. There's a necessity there that wasn't there before. And I think Canadians are more willing to pick up the cost than they have been in quite a long time.
Well, as Kerry alluded, the world has changed somewhat since the 20th of January of this year, when somebody new went into the Oval Office, and dealing with President Trump has been job one for the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, which he talked about in speaking to reporters last month. Let's play a clip of that. Sheldon, if you would.
Canada is ready to take a leadership role in building a coalition of like-minded countries who share our values. We believe in international cooperation. We believe in the free and open exchange of goods, services, and ideas. And if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will.
So he says, okay, Richard Fadden, come in on this. When it was obviously Trudeau and Obama, or Trudeau and Biden, it was a pretty different situation than it is now for Carney and Trump. Is that going to make it more difficult for us to play a leadership role in the world, in your view?
I think it absolutely will. I think the first thing we're going to have to do is stabilize our relationship with the United States. And I think the Prime Minister has got that. But there's still a great deal left on this planet that we can play on. I think we're going to have to accept that we're not going to make a great deal of difference in the relationships between the United States on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. We're simply not going to. But there are all sorts of files where we could play a useful role. You know, the pandemics, climate change, regional institutions, trying to work more effectively with various regional groupings. But I come back to what I said earlier. This is going to take some conscious decisions, some allocation of resources, and the utilization of ministerial and prime ministerial time. I wonder if I could just add a thought to what Kerry said a minute ago. I agree at one level that we need a foreign policy review, but if we're going to be an effective influencer in the world, I think we have to use all the tools that we have available. So whether we have a foreign policy review or not, we need to marshal our foreign policy and operations, defense, security, trade, and economics. It's one of the things we've not done particularly well. We've frequently sort of said, well, there are these few countries in Asia, we want to trade with them. But we've forgotten that they often like a strategic relationship. So I think we're going to have to change our mindset in how to deal with countries. And this is going to require us to, I think, use all the tools that we have available in a coordinated way.
Oh, fair enough. But Kerry, in an era of Trump, what does that mean for Mark Carney right now as he tries to figure all this out?
Well, at the beginning, some people said that Trump would be isolationist, and I don't think that's the case at all. What he's done is reinforced American exceptionalism to a degree that I think is unprecedented for the U.S., using U.S. power in a way that is more of a club and coercion and unpredictable. So with an uncertainty engine like that at the helm of the U.S., what can we do? Well, I'd love us to be able to first focus on stabilizing our relationship with the U.S. Having seen President Trump up close and personal in the first term, I don't think that's feasible. I think he'll keep changing the goalposts. So we have to diversify. We have to diversify to the extent we can, our trade and our defense relationships. But as we do so, can we lead? Yeah, we can lead sometime. We have in the past. We usually in the past have led with ideas. We create tables and we create cross-regional alliances. And as Dick said, we can do it on things where we have an edge. We have something that the rest of the world wants and where there's a gap to fill. Disarmament. The nuclear threat is rising. We've been very good at that traditionally. Democracy and stabilizing democracy and countering disinformation. Critical minerals, you name it. But we have to do so in a way that is joined up. When I called it a foreign policy review as shorthand, but I meant an integrated international policy review that does exactly what Dick just suggested, brings together the various levers.
Can we do all these things if our relationship with the United States is as uncertain as it apparently is?
I think that we have to pay close attention to the United States at all times, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. My concern is this obsession with leading. I'm very comfortable with the idea that Canada should do more. Canada has to step up when other people step back. But stepping up doesn't mean stepping up to the front. It just, right now we're in the back. Stepping up to the middle is an improvement from where we are, and I think that telling the Canadian public that we're going to lead builds expectations that, generally speaking, we can't actually fulfill. When you're only spending 1.3 and a bit percent of your GDP on defense, leading means tripling your defense budget. We're never going to do that. So how about we're going to do more, and we're going to try to replace some of the challenges that America has left for us.
Well, let me find out from all of you whether or not doing more involves something that President Trump brought up on the weekend. As he took a little shot at Canada, which he likes to do. He announced this plan for a Golden Dome missile system, and it's valued at 175 billion American dollars. And he said about Canada, they want to have protection also, so as usual, we help Canada. And I don't think he said it as a compliment. Richard Fadden, should Canada agree to be part of this?
I think it's far too early to agree or to disagree, but I think we have to take it seriously. If we're going to do something on the defense side with the United States seriously, it has to relate to the defense of North America. It may or may not be the Golden Dome. It may be something else. But I think to say off the bat, we're not going to take this seriously at all, would be a mistake. We've declined to participate in these sorts of things over the last several prime ministers. That doesn't mean we should do so right now. I'm no great expert in golden domes, but I have a suspicion that getting it done with Mr. Trump's term, getting it done within the budget he suggests, and whether we can do it as effectively in North America, given the size of North America, as the Iron Dome operates for Israel, which I think is one of the models the president has in mind. So I think we should study it. We should talk about it. And if we don't do the Iron Dome, we have to up our contribution to North American defense in another way. That has to be central to what Mr. Carney is trying to do. He keeps talking about we're going to lead on the economy, we're going to develop new relationships on the economy and security. On the security side, I would suggest we have to start with North America.
Carrie Buck, you want us in on this?
On Golden Dome, the challenge is that I don't think there are detailed plans on what the Golden Dome is, and I think that some of the technology doesn't exist yet. And so the 3-year timeline and the price tag, I think, are wildly unrealistic. That being said, missile technology has really, really improved over the last few years since the last time we talked about SDI in Canada. And
we should just say, because this is an acronym-free zone, Strategic Defense Initiative that came out in Ronald Reagan's time.
Exactly, yeah.
And we didn't leap into that one either.
No, we didn't. But the fact is that both cruise missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles can hit North American territory. And unless we do something to cooperate with the U.S., then they're going to do it for us without asking our permission, and there goes our sovereignty. But how we participate, there are many different ways we can do it. We need to bolster NORAD. We're already looking at bolstering eyes and ears to understand what's coming towards our territory. But we're going to have to talk in Canada about how much we might want to participate in intercepting those missiles. But again, this is a conversation that's going to take a few years to come to fruition. So I think tactically, the Prime Minister has been very wise keeping the door open to the U.S., to our participation, without predicting what kind of participation that might be. And leaving the conversation going without committing too far.
So if this happens in Donald Trump's third term, do we hop on board then?
I think even if...
You didn't even smile at that. That was a little joke and you didn't even smile.
I was thinking of whether I should or not. I think the issue here is even in a third term, this thing wouldn't get done that quickly, and therefore we should avoid making the mistake we made last time, which was saying no to something we hadn't been asked about yet. We didn't have to say no back in 2005, 2006, because there wasn't a formal ask. We said no anyway. It hurt the Canada-U.S. relationship. If the president wants to muse about this dome that would take decades probably to put together, the last thing we need to say is we're out. We can say we're looking to cooperate and work together on the defense of North America, and we can see where that takes us.
Can they do it without us?
Yeah, they can. That's the problem. I mean, if there is an ICBM or a cruise missile heading towards North American territory, they will do it. Better that we get in some form or the other so we can affect the shape of it, the shape of the defense, and have some say in what kind of response there might be and where. Some say.
If we don't join this, what do you think about the risks to our sovereignty, gaining or losing?
I don't know how big a risk it is in this very case, because I don't think the thing will get built all that quickly. And that if we don't join now, when they get more serious, there may be another opportunity to join. So I don't think there's a risk to our sovereignty there, but I do think there's a risk to our relationship with the Trump administration if we start saying no to things that are not even difficult to say yes to. I think that would be a big mistake.
Let's pursue that a little bit more here, because we just heard Mark Carney say in that clip, if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will. Okay, good soundbite, but let's see what that actually means. And we've got a couple of events coming up in the not-too-distant future at which Canada may or may not road test out some of its theories on this. The G7 summit. Richard Fadden, I'll start with you on this. We have the G7 coming up in Alberta in June. What kind of opportunity, in your view, does that present for Canada to make a mark on a world stage?
Well, I think to call a spade a shovel a spade, we have to acknowledge that it's going to depend how President Trump behaves. Remember what happened the last time we had a summit, G7 in Canada. He totally threw it off track. So if he's in that kind of mood again, it's going to make it very, very difficult for us to lead on anything. I tend to think that having a successful summit this time round with President Trump there and President Zelensky there, it will simply be to have the meeting proceed, produce a reasonable communique without a blow-up. I know that sounds like a fairly low bar, but I think we have to be reasonable. Given the unpredictability of Mr. Trump and some of the other issues, if the Prime Minister manages to do that and inject a couple of ideas, I think it will be a success.
Is nobody, Adam, able in a circumstance like this, when Donald Trump starts getting particularly disruptive and unhelpful, is there nobody around that table of the seven biggest, countries in the world who can say, would you mind acting like an adult in the room for a change? Is that possible?
I don't think so at all. At the same time, there are other opportunities at a G7 that do not require the entire G7 to get along. Mr. Carney has an opportunity to meet with 5 other G7 leaders, either one at a time or in groups of 2 and 3, and to do a whole bunch of different things in terms of long-term Canadian commitments to diversifying our relationships. So even if the G7 itself doesn't get much done, the long-term Canadian strategic posture can be improved by the access that the Prime Minister will have to these other heads of government during that period.
Do you think that should be, Kerry, on our agenda, namely isolating Donald Trump and Canada trying to make common cause with the other 5 powers?
Yes and no. Diplomacy is the art of letting somebody else have your way. So I agree entirely with Dick.
Say that again?
Diplomacy is the art of letting somebody else have your way.
Have your way.
Right.
Oh,
and
okay.
both the G7 and NATO depend on consensus. The strength of the communiques and strength of the action for both of those bodies depends on consensus. So it doesn't make sense to go to the table and pick a fight, face direct fight with Donald Trump. Why would it? You'd end up wrecking the things, the institutions, worst case scenario, or the initiatives that you want to carry forward.
Not a fight, but is there a way to sort of marginalize, let him feel like he's a part of the party, but marginalize him and the other 5 serious countries get their business done?
Absolutely, but not at that table. At
Not
that
at that
table.
table.
So working with other middle powers, other members of the G7, for instance, to change our trade and investment flows so that we mitigate against the damage that his tariffs will cause, absolutely. But quiet diplomacy is the order of the day here, particularly for us. If we're seen to be directly orchestrating something that runs against Trump's interest, he'll take a run at us and try some retaliation. Why would we want to court that? So I think it's quiet diplomacy, and at the table, head for a light G7 and seek to obtain the most you can. And there's a lot that can be obtained on issues that the G7 has worked on for a while: critical minerals, support for Ukraine. But don't die in a ditch over, seeking to have the hardest language about Russia in the communique. And then if you lose that, you've actually moved the goalposts back.
Although,
back.
Richard Fadden, I did hear Donald Trump on the news this morning saying some pretty tough things about Vladimir Putin, maybe some of the harshest language he's used about Putin yet. Having said that, if he shows up at this thing and wants to misbehave, is there a way for Canada to do its business with the other 5 and somehow marginalize the United States?
I think it would be a mistake to try and marginalize the United States. I think it will be immediately obvious to them. And I don't think we need to give them any opportunity to criticize us or to accuse us of acting improperly with the very, very close allies. But we don't need to be at a G7 to do that. I mean, the Prime Minister's already started dealing with the United Kingdom and France. I think we should continue this sort of thing. He should go to Asia. He should talk to Japan and a few other countries.
Well, let me pick up on that because the NATO meeting is coming up at the end of June. You're our former NATO ambassador. It's over in The Hague. What should our approach be at that thing?
Well, the main menu item will be, of course, defense spending. Canada's still, the latest NATO figures has us still in what I call a quadrant of shame, in that we're hovering with Belgium as the last 2 who are both below 2% of GDP on defense spending and below 20% of our defense budget on R&D and equipment. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. We're talking now about how much sooner we can reach the 2%, but I expect the Hague Summit at the end of June to reach agreement at around 3.5% of GDP on defense spending, plus an additional 1.5% of non-defense but defense-related spending on things like infrastructure. So, and it is not in our interests, either tactical or policy strategic, to part company with NATO on this. NATO's important for us. right? So that's where we're going to have to focus, and we have to be ready, and we have to start to shift the conversation in Canada closer to that 3 or 3.5% of GDP. It's in our interest. It's not just about placating Donald Trump. The world is fundamentally more dangerous, and we have rusted out, as I said, both our defense and our diplomacy. So we got a lot of catching up to do, and again, we're behind the curve, and we're behind the curve of all of our NATO allies, and NATO really matters to us for reasons much beyond kind of pure defense and much beyond European security, of course. It's transatlantic.
Adam, NATO summit, June. What do we do?
I think part of the issue here is not to embarrass ourselves. We really are a laggard when it comes to commitments to NATO. We have a long way to go. The worst thing you can do in a situation like that is tell other people that you know better in terms of how the organization should go and do its business or how the alliance should function. I think we should be helpful. I think we should be clearer that we're going to do more, and I think that's plenty for this meeting.
Richard Fadden, how do we walk in there, given the laggards that we are, with our head up, trying to be constructive when no doubt everybody's looking at us saying, you guys are in no position to tell us anything?
I think we have to convince our NATO allies, all of them, not just the United States, that there's a new sheriff in town with new priorities and a commitment to increase our spending to the 2% as soon as we can, whether we like the 2% or not. We have to do that if we're going to have any credibility at all.
Gotcha. Let me talk about foreign aid here, because according to Global Affairs Canada, we spend $12 billion a year on foreign aid. And I don't know if that's it's a lot, but I don't know whether it's an appropriate amount for a country of our size. What do you think?
It's not. It doesn't meet the benchmarks that were set way, way back when by Lester Pearson. It doesn't keep company with some of our other kind of like-minded middle power countries. And in an era where the U.S. is pulling back on aid and the horrific impacts that's causing in terms of starvation, deaths, lack of education. You know, using development assistance, it's not just, Boy Scout. It's about pushing your interests out, building your soft power brand, and helping build the world that will actually make it easier for us to avoid conflict and to increase trade. So it doesn't make sense to me that we would be pulling back in this era, especially with the U.S. pulling back on aid. Development assistance, I think, should be increased.
Richard Fadden, your view on that?
I entirely agree with what Kerry has said, and I would only add, we should take this as an area where we can show some international leadership. We should work with other countries. We have to rethink whether or not it's going to be delivered bilaterally or through multilateral institutions. And we should just find a way to maximize its impact while we're increasing what we do and getting others to do the same. But it's a good area for us to show leadership.
Adam, what about if we have to pick up our defense spending a lot, and most Canadians are not that thrilled with the notion of increasing our foreign aid spending, is there a way to divert foreign aid spending to defense spending, and in some respects, kill two birds with one stone?
I think that would be a big mistake. I think the real solution is to level with Canadians about what foreign aid really is. Canadians have been taught to believe that foreign aid is charity. Yeah. If that's what it were, there would be a very good case to make that money should be spent at home. It's not. It's an investment in international stability. It's an investment in new markets for Canadian goods and services producers. It's an investment in international security. If Canadians understand why we're doing this, I think they'll be less likely not to be willing to do it in the first place.
Kerry.
And this walks back to our national narrative on international, what Canada is on the world stage. We have a history of seeing whatever we do with the U.S. as being existential, and the rest of it is kind of optional. We're in a crisis now with the U.S., double down with our relationship with the U.S. and try to avert tariffs. Sure, absolutely. But if we don't diversify and build up the rest of our presence internationally, we will lose both on security and on our economic health. So I'll go back to Dick's first answer, talking about too much focus on values instead of interests. I think the world we want to build would be consistent with Canadians' values and in our interests. I think it's a false distinction. I think we need to rewrite the Canadian narrative on who we are in the world and understand that we give something to the world and we get something back from the world when we invest in that kind of international presence that we've stepped away from for the last few decades.
Richard Fadden, you want to come back on that?
Every country is doing that. It's how we do it and how we balance it with promoting our interests. And I think over the past little while, we've pushed values a little bit too much. And we've assumed, or I would say the previous government assumed, that some of the values they were pushing internationally, they were assuming they were accepted across the board in Canada totally and entirely, and I don't think that was the case. So there's a balance to be had, and the manner that we advance our interests, I think, need a rethink.
Adam, I wonder if you could help us understand, because I don't know, but I suspect if you ask Canadians about foreign aid, they would say charity begins at home, and we should be spending less of that money overseas and more of it at home. Why do you think successive governments have not been able to make the case that you just very eloquently made a moment ago, which is this is in our interest? International stability is in our interest as well. Why have they not done well making that point?
I think because it's a whole lot easier to make the other point, that international aid is just about helping when there's a tsunami. And you don't need $12 billion to help with tsunamis. You can probably do that with 2 or 3. It's a very simple case to make. There are no votes in foreign aid, and so politicians have made that easy case and moved on to something else. Much harder to explain that when people get out of poverty, they can buy your stuff. And when they're in poverty, they can't. When people are in poverty, they tend to resort to things that disrupt the rule of law. When they're stable and happy, they don't. That's a good thing. It's a longer conversation. No one's wanted to have it.
We are down to our last minute here, and I know Anita Anand, the new foreign minister, is watching right now and will want some good advice from you, Carrie Buck, so give it to her.
Stay in your job for long enough to create relationships with your counterparts so you have that credibility and you can show up in a more consistent fashion. We've had a revolving door of foreign ministers. And talk to Canadians about why it matters that we engage internationally.
Sounds like very good advice. It's really not in her hands to be in that job for a long time,
yeah,
right? It kind of depends on the guy at the top of the ticket.
Well, if Mark Carney is watching now, maybe he'll take that advice, but yes.
I'm reliably advised that he watches every night as well.
Yes.
Okay. Richard Fadden?
I think the main bit of advice I would give her is prioritize. Pick 2 or 3 things that you need to do. Insist that the department and the rest of the government follows priorities and be consistent. We cannot be all things to all people in this new environment. So prioritize, prioritize, prioritize.
And Adam, what advice would you give her?
Let your people speak. I think Canadians need to hear more from diplomats. They're extremely bright people. They're almost universally well-spoken, and I think it will look good for you if you let your diplomats actually speak to Canadians publicly themselves. You don't have to vet everything they say. You can trust that they'll make you look good.
I want to thank you 3 for joining us here on TVO tonight. Carrie Buck, our former Canadian ambassador to NATO, senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. Adam Chapnick, professor of defense studies at RMC. Canada First, Not Canada Alone is his book. And Richard Fadden, former director of CSIS and the former national security advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. It's great to have all 3 of you on our program this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
With every new session of Parliament comes a tradition that is crucial to our democratic process. And just minutes later, it's completely meaningless. Let's talk about the speech from the throne. Picture this. Canada's just had a federal election. The government is ready to implement its campaign promises. New MPs are in the House of Commons, but then there are 3 knocks at the door. Enter the usher of the Black Rod, holding the ceremonial ebony cane. He's there to invite MPs to the Senate chamber because neither the monarch nor senators are allowed in the House of Commons. But before he can speak, the usher is challenged by the Sergeant-at-Arms and asked to state his business. It's a little ceremonial throwback to the struggle for power between the Crown and Parliament. Once inside the Senate chamber, MPs hear the speech from the throne. It's a tradition borrowed from the UK, where the King literally reads the speech himself. In Canada, it's read by the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor in the provinces. After all, it's their job to represent the Crown. But on 3 occasions, the Sovereign has read the speech from the throne in person. Queen Elizabeth II in 1957 and 1977, and Charles III in 2025. whoever reads it, it's the elected government that's holding the pen. It lays out the priorities that the Prime Minister or Premier wants to address in the months ahead. Sounds important, right? There's a catch. Right after the speech ends, the First Minister will rise in the legislature and introduce a bill that says more or less, hey, everything you just heard from the Crown, that's fine, but we're still going to do whatever we want. I never said this made any sense. This is the legislature asserting its independence from the Crown. It's a tradition in the English Parliament going back to at least the 1500s. In the British House of Commons, it's called the Outlawries Bill. In the Canadian House of Commons, it's Bill C-1, an act respecting the administration of oaths of office. It has nothing to do with oaths of office. In the Senate, it's S-1, an act relating to railways. It has nothing to do with railways. In Ontario, Bill 1 is titled an act to perpetuate an ancient parliamentary right. That one at least actually explains what's going on. Elected members of Parliament are basically saying to the Crown, hey, you're not actually the boss of us. Now, you might be asking, is this not a showy waste of time? And you would not be wrong. But hear me out, because the real action comes next. MPs debate their response to the speech, and that response has to be a matter of confidence. Basically, if a majority of Parliament doesn't like what it hears in the speech, it can defeat the government right then and there. That is precisely what happened in 1985. Progressive Conservatives had won the most seats in the Ontario legislature, but not a majority. The Liberals and New Democrats defeated the government on the throne speech debate, and the Liberal leader, David Pearson, became Premier shortly after. Just like that, a 40-year-long Tory dynasty was finished. So yeah, it's symbolic, but it matters. The speech from the throne comes from a time when Parliament was weak and the Crown was powerful. The monarch would summon Parliament and dictate what it was expected to carry out. Over centuries, reformers gradually wrestled power away from the Crown. These days, the speech from the throne is a bit of show where governments lay out their plans and give elected members of Parliament the opportunity to either support or oppose them. But it's also a reminder, we didn't inherit democracy. We fought for it.
And that is the agenda for Monday, May 26th, 2025. Tomorrow, The Atlantic's David Frum is here to discuss how Donald Trump is reshaping American democracy and the world beyond. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.